Kuala Lumpur Open Challenge 2014 semi-final. Congratulations to all teams for making it this far in the competition. On the opening government we have UCT 1. On the opening opposition we have ANU. At the closing government we have Auckland. At the closing opposition we have Cambridge. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to speak to the motion that stands has
So in terms of what exactly the culture of outrage is the reason they showed it to you in that format. It's very difficult to define directly. You note and you see it mostly, but what we would say as an attempt at it is that it is the expression of an overt negative emotional reaction in the public discourse and arguments, alright? You get really mad, you get really angry, and you choose to vent that in the context of the argument or discussion that you are having. You communicate that directly to the people you're involved with in an overt and pretty hectic manner. So let's talk about what it is that we don't like about this, right? We think we put a lot of value on reasoned debates and discussion. We think the value that lies underneath it is the idea that we can make progression through reasoning as opposed to the lack of progression through the absence of it. Primarily speaking, we are advocating something along the lines of Stoicism, which is to say that one attempts to meditate against, or at least to moderate one's emotional reactions to situations rather than to give into them a celebration of the expression of emotion. We're not trying to say you've got to become a robot. You may well feel those things inside. We're saying moderate your interactions with other people. Alright, what are we interested in here in terms of how it undermines this reasoned discussion that we want? Alright? So the first thing I'm going to just put out a whole lot of bottom line things here. The basic observation is that there's a trade-off to be had between the extent to which you allow emotion to overwhelm yourself and the discussion, and your capacity to engage in the analysis, both for yourself and for the person who's responding to you in that context. So there are basic things that go on in terms of how your brain works that imply this, right? The first thing is that there's a spiraling effect of this. We understand that the way that you act influences the way you think, which is why smiling releases endorphins into your brain. It's why being grumpy and frowning means that your brain starts implicating itself in that emotional reaction. No thank you. What we would say then is that basically, the more you rage, the more you are going to rage. It's an upward spiral of raging. So anyone who's played MOBAs online fully understands this, alright? So the basic idea is that it's not something that you're going to vent and just get out of your system, alright? There's no therapeutic dimension to the way that the culture of raging works. Second thing to say here is that there are elements in terms of how your brain works that means you can't engage at the highest level of rationality and argumentation under these contexts, alright? One of those things, for example, is the fight or flight mechanism. When you engage very powerful negative affect, what your brain starts to do, go back to your bear in a cave situation, it thinks something's going horribly wrong. It engages the idea that either you need to start gearing up to antagonize and engage this thing, not in a reasoned way, but in a destructive manner, which is your flight, or you need to engage in a fight. Or you need to engage in a flight. We think both of those are really bad for reasoned discourse, either because the person's going to disinvest and get the hell out of there, which is obviously not good for reasoned discourse, or because you're going to try and make it as destructive as possible. We think that's really bad, okay? We think that one of the best things about reasoned discourse is that it allows for compromise. The reaction you are engaging is precisely a non-compromising reaction. Not only because you are entering into the fight mechanism, but because someone else now is responding to your fight mechanism, they too get involved in that. We are social creatures at the bottom line. If I smile at you, your most likely reaction is to smile back at me. Debaters may struggle to understand this. But by and large, that's how the human world works, right? So it's the idea that when I see you behaving in certain ways, if I start crossing my arms, statistical likelihood is more people in the audience start crossing their arms. We've all seen monkeys do this, and we think it's very interesting when monkeys do it. We do it too, right? So the basic idea is that when we start engaging this mode, we make other people engage that, whether consciously or not. most of this is unconscious, but not subconscious. I'm not a Freudian here, right? But it's a non-deliberative, deliberate action. We think that's very bad. What's also really bad is that your brain doesn't just work in one homogeneous way. It's got different functionality. It goes from the very basic functionality to the more higher order functionality. This is what evolution gave us, right? So your higher order functionality is where you do most of your good reasoning and argumentation. We like to believe we're all engaging it right now. The trouble is that when you get involved in these high intensity situations, high stress situations, which is what you're, everything I've been explaining now, you're reinforcing and creating, your brain starts prioritizing lower order rather than higher order functionality. It's a consequence of the way that our brains developed. Why? Because you don't need to sit and reason about the 50 reasons why you need to run from the bear after you. You just need to fucking run. So that's the trouble, is that you start undermining your capacity to think in terms of your best functionality of your brain. Which is to say that the thing that we think is so valuable, your brain explicitly starts lowering that on the priority level. We think that's very damaging to reason discourse opening.
Are all respondents to an expression of outrage necessarily going to respond with irrational discourse?
I don't think that we have to say that it's a 100% likelihood. I think we have to say it is a statistically relevant and a powerful reaction likely to occur. I think everything I've just said says that that's the case. I mean, unless your POI is going to, I don't know, try and topple all of this in one go, good luck with that. You have your case for that, I imagine. Alright, so basically what we think is that this is problematic, alright, for all of those reasons, but also you are less likely to be taken seriously. It's the reason we all laugh at somebody who just stands up and rages. No, thank you. Very eloquent. You know, like, you can see the strategy being presented here, right? So basically, we don't take somebody as seriously in that context. Why? Because we say, oh, they're just being ragey, alright? This is one of the problems when we start turning around. This is sex assignment when you turn around and say to somebody who's raging, oh, you're just being hysterical now. Stop doing that. You know, it's all just being emotional. Whether we like or don't like the fact that people do that, we know they do that. So we don't think that's good. We don't like tone censoring, alright? Which is effectively that's just one of the very specific things that happens. But it's a general instance of this. When somebody expresses a very significant degree of emotion in their discourse, it's very easy to attribute what they're saying to their emotions rather than to their reasons, okay? In the context of feminism, that's been pretty damaging. We don't think it's in the interests of these institutions, even if they are very angry, and we understand that they are angry. Unfortunately, it detracts from the reasons that they're putting forward. We think you're under a, well, duty may be a strong term here, but we certainly oppose the scenario in which your actions are undermining the point that you're there to make, right? The reasons that you're presenting, we think you ought to prioritize their effectiveness. We don't think honesty in this context is particularly valuable. Sometimes it's good not to be honest and to prioritize something more important. Like when I don't criticize the clothing people are wearing because I think that it's important not to undermine their self-esteem. So we don't think that's the only thing going on in terms of honesty. Last thing to say in terms of wrapping up from my side here is that we think this is actually a problem in terms of a selfish situation, alright? Often people will try and prioritize the immediate emotive impact of what they're saying. That might get their one cause to work, maybe in some situations because of shock, but what it does, in terms of everything I've just shown you, is it undermines long-run implications of reasoned discourse. We stand by that.
I'd like to welcome the leader of the opposition.
Members of the House, there are two factors in the modern world which disempower individuals. The first is the fact that the overwhelming amount of information with which individuals are inundated means that we live in a confusing world where it is incredibly difficult to distinguish which facts are important, which causes are meaningful, and which ones are central to us. Second, our increased epistemic proximity diminishes the feeling of real agency. What I mean by this is, we know much more about the world today than we did before the era of the internet. Before the internet existed, before social media was popular, people had no idea what was happening. So the fact that we know, like now, much more to a far greater extent, what the trauma and what the suffering of other human beings is like, and yet feel completely unable to influence these things, including our own suffering, means that individuals in the modern world are hugely disempowered. We think the culture of outrage does wonders for this. I'm going to bring you two arguments in rebuttal to be entirely integrated. First, that outrage is generally empowering to individuals. Second, that it promotes change, particularly for disenfranchised groups. First, generally empowering individuals. The first thing we're going to say about this is that outrage and the modern culture of outrage provides a platform in which people can express themselves. So we do think that it's a general good, more the increased ability to express yourself and to be meaningfully heard by other people is important. Like, it is not meaningful for me to express myself if there's no one listening. Now, they might say, yeah, you can express yourself in other ways, right? Like, why is outrage particularly important? And we argue that outrage is that the expression of sentiment is an equally valid form of expression. So, if I am a person who has been a victim of a horrible crime, a crime in which I am made to feel powerless, thank you, in which I am made to feel like other people have ganged up against me to oppress me, this is a sentiment which I should be able to express. And importantly, the culture of outrage not only allows me to express the sentiment, but it also allows me to feel support. Because consider what the culture of outrage actually means in terms of social media. Like the fact of trending, hashtags, of developing a group of followers, means that I feel not only like I've been able to express myself to many human beings at once, but that those human beings actually care about my suffering. So as a person who has been victimized, thank you, the biggest priority for me as a person is to feel like other human beings are aware of my suffering, thank you, and care for me. Now they might say, yes, but what about people who don't agree with me? Like, you could create a culture of counter-outrage where people hate me. And we are going to suggest, this is contentious, so listen very carefully. To some extent, discourse can be walled off. So if I'm a person who has been a victim of a horrendous crime, I can wall myself off of other sentiments by enclosing myself within a private echo chamber where I only look at what people who are like me are saying about me. Now, does this mean discourse as a whole is shut off? No, because not everyone wants to wall themselves off. We'll get to that a bit later. So on these counts, and like the final thing I want to say in response to the argument about how this is not therapeutic, like we don't understand why expression is not therapeutic. Being able to tell people about my suffering is hugely therapeutic. But also, like even if we took the argument as best, right? The argument is but there's an upward spiral of anger. We think that this upward spiral of anger is broken by the fact that people are not on their Twitter feed 24 hours a day. Like, as with all expressions of sentiment, they generally occur in a periodic fashion, right? Like, I occasionally express myself in a certain way, I occasionally vent, I occasionally look for something which makes me feel comfortable, like eating chocolate, or eating something which is my favorite food. And these are always like, this is the periodic way in which people arrange their lifestyle. It's not like I have to constantly expose myself to things that make me angry. It just isn't how human beings work. So in all these counts, we think that outrage is hugely empowering individuals. Now, why is this important? Like, they might say, even if we consider the argument about discourse, which we're not going to concede, by the way, we don't see why the disempowering individuals is any less important than general discourse in society. First, because the benefit to me is hugely tangible. Like discourse, I mean, yeah, people talking about things seems kind of important, but allowing me to feel emotional closure for being victimized or something is important. We think that's a form of tangible harm. But also we think that the greater good of society is constituted by the happiness of its individuals. So insofar as the culture of outrage empowers individuals, we do think there is a general societal benefit. So that's the metric by which we want government to engage. So how do we promote change, particularly for minority groups? The first thing I want to say is that, like, their model of stoicism is, there's a reason, guys, I'll take it in a moment, why stoicism failed. Because it's utterly boring. And boring things, as we generally accept, are not particularly conducive to human beings who have far too many things to care about. Before I proceed.
Your argument that they won't have to be exposed to this very much because people typically try to distance themselves from having too much anger in their face is a concession of what we're arguing, that the more anger you have to engage with, the less likely you are to engage with that discussion.
Okay, well, some people will choose to wall themselves off. So, as I'm about to explain, other people will think that there is actually value in engaging, because this is just factually how human beings think. So, let's talk about change. Now, the first thing I want to say is there are some individuals who require vehicles of expression because they have been shut off by popular discourse. These are people who don't have the numbers, thank you, to make any meaningful change in the discourse, minority groups. They are people whose plights seem less, which are generally ignored by the news cycle. So for instance, like reporting on LGBT rights is huge, but reporting on the rights of transgender people is not as huge. No, thank you. There are just some topics which have not entered the public discourse in which the news cycle tends to suppress. So there are some people, especially minorities, who are closed off the discourse. They need a way to reach out to them. What do you need in order to reach other people? We're going to suggest two things. First, that outrage has huge communicative value. It spreads a message. So, comparatively, even if this message was purely emotive in content, without any cognitive value, we think simply allowing the message to spread to more people, and more people feeling angry about a cause, is more likely to cause them to do something about it. Why is outrage easy to spread? Because it taps into a very primeval feeling of psyche, a very primeval aspect of the human psyche, which is precisely what it characterizes the fight or flight response, we're going to suggest it is the desire for human beings to participate in engagement. So like, the feeling I get when I rally behind someone, I say, yes, you are right to be angry about this, and I want to join that. It's an irreplaceable mode of communication because I want to experience that thrill of engaging in something which is a meaningful fight. So this is why on our side, we think there is a huge communicative value in the culture of outrage. The second, discourse is actually possible, and rational discourse too. They said, but the problem with the culture of outrage is that it's non-deliberative. Yes, non-deliberative stimuli can lead to deliberative mental states. So my outrage at an initial act, which I read or hear about, can lead me to think about it, because this is generated. So we accept, they're going to say, your social media is terrible for this, right? Because short sentences, because people get very angry and patriotic. Yes, we can see all of that. But we still think on the broader whole, people who leave social media and go elsewhere in the communities can then interact about things which they now feel engaged with. The comparative is on your side, your stoic model is not going to get any engagement, guys, because giving someone a fact sheet is utterly boring. Our side promotes engagement to a culture which can then be followed by deliberative discourse. This is good. So we are not mutually exclusive with reasoned discourse. We think our side promotes better change for individuals. We are power victims. Very proud to it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue to take over.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what I'm going to try and do with my speech is I'm going to try and ground some of these arguments in the real cases where a culture of outrage needs to be effective and we think it's horribly failed. So what are the majority of the cases we're talking about, right? So we're talking about like feminists being outraged at misogyny in society, where people, for example, really upset at a scientist wearing a t-shirt with some scantily dressed women on it. That's where the culture of outrage needs to be effective, and we think it's done dismally, right? What we're going to say is that that undermines discourse that's very important to changing the minds of people who you need to change in order to actually get social empowerment, right? We think that that's the real problem with the culture of outrage, and they've been overly dismissive to that. So two things. First, I'm going to talk about the psyche, something that's been largely ignored on their side, and then I'm going to talk about discourse. So what we tell you is that in general, the culture of outrage isn't necessarily an honest expression of emotion in the majority of cases. Why? Because we think there's a spiral of negative emotions that actually clouds one's judgment and one's ability to reflect and express themselves. What they say is that that spiral is terminating, no thank you, because once you're not on social media, the emotion stops. Completely doesn't understand how human beings work. You continue to have emotions after the event itself. It means you're angry in your everyday interactions. It undermines your ability to interact with people, no thank you. When other people are being angry online as well, that fuels your negative emotions, and it in fact creates a disconnect from your real emotions, and it imposes on you ones that are worse. We think the culture of outrage is worse for the human psyche. It encourages people who are otherwise moderate, if they wish to engage in discourse, to try to be outraged, to make themselves angry. And we think that in that sense it isn't necessarily encouraging an honest expression or even a healthy expression for human beings. No thank you. Right, let's now talk about discourse. So what did they tell us? Well, the first contention is that some people can respond well to this culture of outrage. We think patently false and empirically false, right? If you look at the way that people have responded to the fact that people get so upset at instances of misogyny in popular culture, what we see is that people on the other side, the people whose minds you're really trying to change, don't necessarily understand this emotion, and they have an emotional response as well. Feminists attacking men in an emotional way, which you think perhaps they're entitled to those emotions, causes those men to feel personally attacked, and that leads to an emotional response on their part. Sure, some people will be able to respond to this well. Some people will be able to respond well in the face of the culture of outrage. However, we think there's a very strong, no thank you, crowding out effect off those people who do respond well. So if you want to respond in a way where you give some analysis in response to someone's outrage at like someone wearing a shirt with naked women on it, we think that you're crowded out by the hundreds of other people who are just saying they're so upset with it, or just saying, like, get the hell over it, right? We don't care about this, you're being idiots. We think that that sort of discourse crowds out people who actually do engage with it meaningfully. And what that means is that if you are a reflective person, you tend to shy away from social media, right? You become no longer interested in this sort of discourse because it doesn't really give a place for you. And we think that's incredibly problematic. What they say is that it empowers individuals. But we think one massive problem is that your ability to express outrage, no thank you, is not necessarily correlated with how important your grievance is. Which is why we see in social media people being outraged at Coney 2012, which is a far less important issue where the facts are confused, where otherwise they're much more important things. The fact that we can save people's lives in Africa for less than like $10 if we buy them malaria nets. The problem is that this culture of outrage draws attention to the wrong sorts of things, and we think if everyone's competing on an equal playing field, relying on analysis and reasoned discourse, we don't think this happens. That's where we think it's a lot more likely that people are going to find and attention's going to be drawn to the most important things. There's certainly things you can do to express emotion, no thank you, that aren't indicative of a culture of outrage, right? So we can see images in the news. These sorts of things, we think are things that we ought to be responding to, but aren't part of this culture where everyone's merely expressing their anger. Additionally, what we would say is that the culture of outrage itself weakens outrage's effectiveness, right? So it's counterintuitive in that sense. I'll take you in a moment. So when you have a grievance, right, so you're a woman who's angry at rape culture, you're expressing outrage. There are other people expressing outrage at far less significant things, and it means the effectiveness of your expression is effectively nullified, yes?
You think it's better for people to see pictures on social media, but these pictures usually lead to cultures of outrage because things like seeing images of police brutality tend to make people angry. So what is your comparative model on this course?
We think the comparative model is you see pictures of things like police brutality and you respond in a reasoned way saying like, I understand the fact that the police might feel threatened in some circumstances, but the appropriate response is not to go all out with violence, right? That sort of discourse is much better because people who don't agree with you are in a position where they're much more capable of engaging with you because they don't feel personally attacked. That's something we think in the past happened a lot more than happens now, and we think the culture's getting worse, right? So we think that sort of discourse is what we want. They talk about this idea that you can wall yourself off, right? If you don't want to be too aggravated by this sort of discourse. We think that's massively problematic. The fact that people are walling themselves off, are limiting the spheres of their engagement to avoid vitriol is massively problematic. The fact that, like, if you're expressing a feminist sentiment, but you wall yourself off from everyone who might be misogynistic, means the capacity for that dialogue to actually change those people's minds is weakened. We think on balance, right, it might be nice for you as an individual to express your personal outrage, but we think it's a deeply selfish thing that undermines your higher goals. The fact that you're willing to let other people carry on going through the same suffering as you because you weren't able to moderate yourself in your discourse so as to effectively change others, we think is morally reprehensible, and it's a reprehensible culture. When they talk about minorities, we think they've missed the point of this debate. For all these reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And to conclude the case for the opening opposition, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the
Oh. Sorry, guys. individuals do not historically communicate with other human beings through this mechanical rationality that their side wants to talk about. What we gave your side opposition was this idea that we achieved more realistic discourse by engaging with other human beings through emotions, through empathy, and that discourse reached more people in the long run. That was why we were so proud to oppose. What I have to talk to you about today, 3 issues. Firstly, how does the expression of outrage actually affect the individuals that do this? Secondly, can outrage actually produce rational discourse? And finally, can collective outrage therefore produce changes in society that are actually beneficial? So on this first idea of the expression of outrage and how this affects the individual, we told you on our side of the house that what we gave individuals living within a society that was inundated with information, inundated with like a democratic system that didn't necessarily represent their interests, for individuals who felt powerless, was that we gave them a medium whereby they could express that experience or that feeling of anger or sadness or injustice that they felt. They wanted to tell us that we were just like exemplifying this anger or producing this anger. Mr. Speaker, the reason these people are angry are not because they want to be outraged, but it's because they have had an experience or an event that has caused that anger in the first place. And we say that this is a therapeutic medium whereby they can express that anger, right? But moreover, we say that like the real crux of this debate is that not every single person in society has the capacity for rational outrage, right? Why is that? Because like we think that when people are affected by a particular event, they might be like inundated with like feelings of anger and whatever, and so they can initiate that exchange of information with something that is emotional or irrational. We think that what is produced as a consequence of that dialogue that exists is either we educate that like individual on like why they are feeling a particular way they are through rationality, or we offer them empathy and like irrational like support, right? Either of which benefits that individual. So we point to examples like women who like aren't aware of why they are catcalled, but feel outraged by the fact they are catcalled. But when they express that sort of experiences on the internet through their outrage, they finally understand that there is actually a thing called rape culture, and they understand that even though that is bad, it is not their fault that something like that has happened to them. So we say that an outrage is actually valuable because it can engage other like individuals into rational discourse, and that was why we are happy to propose. On the second point of whether outrage can actually produce rational discourse, what did we hear from their side of the house? They told us that outrage was a natural dichotomy and a natural opposite to this idea of rationality. We thought this was absolutely absurd, right? Why is that? Because outrage may initially be an expression of like human emotion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that kind of dialogue or dynamic stays stagnant, right? We think that that kind of like irrationality can turn to rational discourse depending on who responds to that particular expression of like outrage. Because we think it is a public domain, we think that a multitude and a diversity of people can engage in that dialogue. And what we say is that like we think that like that has the capacity to allow rational people to enter into that conversation and produce an exchange that can be constructive. But moreover, we say that like it's not mutually exclusive. Why is that? Firstly, because we say that like rational people under our model aren't silenced. Like if they want to engage in their own platform of rationality, they can do that, and we're not stopping that from happening. But secondly, we say that like people who currently express outrage under the status quo aren't necessarily going to just produce rationality, right? We think what's more likely to happen is they're going to feel oppressed. They're going to feel as though they can't express what they are feeling, and we thought that that was not conducive to this idea of discourse. But finally, we say that like discourse doesn't always remain stagnant. So what might be irrational is like firstly, it like might turn into a rational conversation in the long term. Secondly, we also refute this idea that rationality in itself is bad. Why is that? Because we think that emotions are responsible for the strongest social movements and social empathy in the world, right? Because we point to things like the civil rights movement that wasn't like promoted by rationality, but rather promoted by things as like anger because the African American community was being oppressed, right? We think that those sorts of examples are really good examples of where social policy is determined on the basis of like human empathy and human experiences. We say that like moreover, not all social policy is determined like that. So we point to things like Kevin Rudd's apology, which was like a more like human kind of policy and a more human act that was produced not because of rationality, but because of human experiences. But moreover, we say that like on their side of the house, there was no harm to this idea of like irrational discourse, because if it's not mutually exclusive, then even if we just just get marginal benefits in increasing the amount of discourse that happens under the status quo. We still benefit, we still win this debate. Finally, on this point of like, can collective outrage produce social changes that are beneficial? Take closing.
The two most successful group rights campaigns were led by Gandhi and MLK. That's because they tapped into the battered, tired and oppressed people by moving them through silent protest. That's what gets change, silent protest and dialogue, not outrage.
That is one example, right guys? So we're not saying that rationality is like never going to get you change. We say that rationality can get you change. We say that human experiences, shared empathy and anger and that sort of stuff can also get you change. See examples that I've mentioned. Okay, finally on this idea of can collective outrage produce social change that is beneficial? Yes, it can. And what does that actually look like, Mr. Speaker? We think this responds directly to this idea that like when we promote a culture of outrage, we're just being selfish. So we don't think that is actually the case. We think that when you have an expression of outrage, what you do is you promote collective action. You promote other people to respond to that and to engage with that social movement. What we think happens then is you provide support for that cause or you allow empathy for that cause. We think that what that does in the long term, it provides like a collective whereby the sorts of actions that you can take is more meaningful within the social arena. So we point to things like the fact that Red Food made a really, really terrible music video in the past, and one person's social outrage on the media promoted other people to be socially outraged. What that consequently led to was a petition whereby Red Food was banned from hosting a TV show in Australia. We thought it was that sort of outrage that actually produced positive changes within society that was actually beneficial to society as a whole. Mr. Speaker, on our side of the House, we actually understood what it meant to be a human being and what it meant to appeal to people in a way that made them feel as though they were vested in a particular issue so that they would promote change in of itself. We were so proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps the most heart-rendering and palatable moment of recently in Ferguson was when a woman who had just lost her son stood up and silently and peacefully lamented the fact that America has had a history of oppression against black people. I can never understand what it would feel like to be black in America. I can never understand what that mother is feeling. But when they try to convey it in a way that leads me to empathize, that's when you get change. When grievance becomes vitriol and when protests become violent, you lose progress and you don't get the kind of durable change that is necessary for groups that are trying to create change in societies around the world. At Closing Government, we're going to be the first team to move past this nebulous discussion of culture, of echo chambers, and of ideas, and concretely talk through why a culture of outrage is inimical to social change that is beneficial for the groups that most need it in society. So, I want to make one comment about the debate so far, and it's the point that the opening opposition said, which was that outrage empowers minority groups. And sure, in Closing Government we say it's very easy to be outraged if you're a member of a minority group initially. But with most of the groups we're talking about, like black people in America, this feeling of disempowerment, of jadedness, of tiredness, of cultural oppression has lasted for hundreds of years. Outrage isn't enough for those people. You need to convey that feeling of grievance to the public, because they're the ones that can try and understand it. They can try and understand what you're going through, and you need the support of the majority on your side to actually create durable change. That's why we don't think it's actually empowering to minority groups, and I'm going to talk more through this process in my extension, which I want to begin right now, because it's going to be the most important point in this debate. Why is social progress best created, not through a culture of outrage, but through the alternative? That, of course, in this debate, it sounds unifying to say, I am angry at something. We are all angry at something. And sure, you can have legitimate grievances, and there are many legitimate grievances that people have around the world. The question in this debate is how are these best expressed, and how do they best create change? And the first thing to understand here is that movements and social movements, indeed in the past, always comprise a spectrum. The opening opposition gave you the example of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. We think that you had, for instance, Martin Luther King was more peaceful, Malcolm X, who was more militant, who led the Black Power faction of that civil rights movement. Those in Ferguson who go around and chant no justice, no peace, those who throw rocks at cars. Martin Luther King is the one we remember. Martin Luther King is the one who created the most change. Martin Luther King is the one who the lunch ladies and the teachers and the mums and dads could all get behind, they could all understand. And that's because it's far more palatable to the mainstream, the people whose hearts and minds you actually need to capture in order to create the types of change that those movements need. Because saying you are hurt and trying to convey that hurt through language and through silent protests and through movements on the streets is far more convincing to those people because it touches them in a place that outrage simply doesn't. Because they don't understand those issues. They can never understand those issues. So outrage simply doesn't do enough for those people. The second reason is that a culture of outrage and the way it's manifested in the mainstream is polarizing and oppositional. What does that mean? That's why Malcolm X never gained the same traction that MLK did. Because the white mainstream people could never understand and they were necessarily the subject of the vitriol, or in some cases that actually came out from that movement. That's why you see the Republicans and the Democrats as not necessarily divided on political lines, but tribal lines, that's fermented by the very types of oppositional and polarizational discourse that actually happens. There's inimical to discussion that actually stops change. The same thing is happening in Ferguson right now, and that's what I mentioned in my introduction. You need messages that everyone can get behind and understand, not ones that exclude people. Because the people that are usually excluded by those messages are the ones whose support you need to create change in those movements. We think Ferguson is a very good example. Because the types of progress that needed to be made was brutalized by rioting. It's the type of culture that led to the mainstream media saying 2 police officers killed in revenge attack for Ferguson. That is not productive and that doesn't lead to change because it can never capture the support of the minority. Because some of the white people who read that article, who read that headline, start to think that they are the victims, not the black people who are the actual victims and the ones who are suffering the most. Those were the people that needed change. No thank you. Another reason as to why this is also not productive and actually stops social change is that you have, for instance, the media that is dichotomized in many instances, which also creates messages that stop that social change. Bill O'Reilly rabble-rousers in response to the black vagrants who need to pull up their bootstraps and not be vandal, as opposed to the actual message, which wasn't even reflective of the whole movement. But at the point where you have a culture of outrage that leads to those acts happening, the discussion is hijacked by the right, or in this instance, or by groups that aren't on your side, who are necessarily the opposition to you. They capture the mainstream, they capture the message, and they stop actual change being created. That's also problematic for those movements. They validate those minority groups as morally inferior and not ones subject or worthy of discussion. Movements that eschew outrage, by contrast, lead to more durable and substantive change for the groups that most need that support. Gandhi is someone who was beyond moral reproach in the eyes of the British public on all the people who supported them. The media could not latch onto anything to stop his change. Why is that? Because you get buy-in from the majority whose support you need when you don't actually include them as the enemy and you get them on side. You create political will to pass laws that help the minority groups whose support you need. Before I go on, I'll say closing.
This is a culture of outrage in moderates, especially powerful position, because they're the only individuals who can break that deadlock and apathy that people might feel towards the morality.
Yeah, sure. Moderates are the most important stakeholder when you're trying to create change. The point is, when you exclude them from the discussion, if they're white in the example of Ferguson, you don't get the support. You don't get the political will you need to create those changes. You just stop that political will ever coming to the fore, and we think it's much better to get them on your side, to convey that hurt to them, as compared to simply trying to exclude them. Because by definition in these types of issues, they probably don't understand what the blacks are going through. But we don't think that helps society. It's more than just political will and creating laws. It's the types of small steps that peaceful projects actually create which lead to long-term change. It's things like who a community decides to elect as their district attorney and who's going to prosecute cases. It's things like who you elect as the police chief, what you think about hiring quotas in the police force for black people. At the point where you get mainstream messages that are peaceful and that try to say, maybe we should have a quota for black people in the police force. Maybe the district attorney should be black because they'll better understand whether or not we should prosecute certain cases. Maybe he's going to convey the information to a grand jury in a way that is not overtly biased and so it stops progress and stops justice. Those are the types of incremental changes that peaceful protests create. Cultures of outrage don't create those incremental steps and they never lead to durable change because they necessarily stop that progress. Change is slow. Progress is slow. Outrage is easy. It's also easy to dismiss. We're opposed.
Watching the case for the closing opposition, I'd like to welcome John Mr.
very strange has happened in this debate. Because in a debate that we believe happens from the perspective of democracy, this debate has become very explicitly consequentialist. It is about whether or not US movement will end up alienating some people, whether or not it will create inefficiency, whether or not it will create deadlock. My first point of extension is about why that metric is inappropriate and why the standards which they have used to judge so-called rational discourse are inappropriate, and we think that this is good because it has allowed people to participate in democracy. Secondly, I want to take that with the strongest. Assuming a purely consequentialist moral metric, even if that is correct, I'm going to tell you why it is a counter of outrage that gives moderates a special position of power, and is exactly what makes them powerful. It makes them the individuals who are able to get things done, and they wouldn't have been able to do this if not for a culture of outrage. So before that, some brief points of thought. So the first thing we came up with opening is a lot of fairly strange sciencey assertions about the way in which chemicals in our brain work. Maybe those are correct. Most of their analysis talked about chemical reactions that take place in the space of a couple of seconds, like if a tiger is running at me, right? We suggest that individuals who have more time than a couple of seconds to think about what they're going to do have the capacity to screen out, or at least take into account the fact that people are emotional in expressing their opinions, and not take them on wholesale. What they do take away from it is the fact that you do care very strongly about this, and that you have a certain interest in this being done. But then he said, no, thank you, well, the problem is that outrage does not track things that are objectively important. It's unclear to me why you have a right to determine what is objectively important for people. It seems to me that the emotion with which they express their opinions is a very good way of tracking that. But then they said, well, the problem is that you have people like Martin Luther King and like Gandhi. Yes, but people like Martin Luther King existed before. Martin Luther King became powerful against the backdrop of a large number of individuals who were subscribing to the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, and who were advocating for violence. He became powerful not because he was just a nice guy, because in a culture, no thank you, where violence was the norm, he stood out and became the tiebreaker because people flocked to him in response. He was a contrast, and that was very, very powerful. That was not the case before the Black Panthers had become a powerful movement. So that rebuttal, most of the remaining stuff will be integrated. Firstly, therefore, let's talk about discourse and what it means to be rational. Because these guys seem to say that if you express emotion in a certain statement, that runs in direct contrast to rational content of what we want to be discussing about. We think this is wrong for two reasons. The first is that many people take moral positions in lives that they deeply care about. But moral questions, no thank you, are not questions of strict rationality or things that we can decide by reference to empiric data, right? So for instance, look at all the counter of outrage around Obama. He's a dictator, he's anti-American, he's against God in our country. A big part of that is the moral expression of outrage of people who fundamentally believe it is wrong for a government to coerce me in any way, and that taxation is theft. Now, whether or not we believe in that is often not a consequence of some kind of rational argument we can make, but the strength of our moral convictions on it. And denying people or regretting the capacity of people to express emotions is tantamount to saying that people should not be allowed, no thank you, to express their moral sentiment on an issue in the very first instance. The second thing we'd like to say is that outrage is also a function of the personal importance that you place on a certain issue, right? I mean, as all debaters show, it's not just about the truth of your point, it's about the impacting of that point. Now, we don't want to talk about it in a consequentialist sense. What I will say is this, right? There are millions of issues that you as an individual could care about, but there's some things that you will care about a lot more than others. The importance of emotion, it allows you to delineate what issues are important to you as an individual or in a community, in a way that a culture that is not outrage would never be able to do. How am I supposed to know what issue a person prioritizes if he speaks about them in the same tones without telling me what are the things that impact them emotionally in a very specific way? Now, all of this might look consequentialist, but we do not think this is in fact consequentialist, because democracy does not presume that a certain set of outcomes is important, right? We don't design democracy to achieve a certain set of outcomes. What we design democracy to do is to give people information that they can make decisions based on. But I'll take opening in a moment. Crucially then, outrage is a useful kind of information for people to have. Yes, they might feel alienated, they might feel victimized and hence reject the opposing side's stance. I think that's a decision that people ought to be free to make for themselves. But if they make that decision on the basis of more information about how the other group cares about them, that's a legitimate choice, and we ought to let democracy settle those issues for us, rather than presuming that that's something's correct. Go. We think that culture's selfish, and we favour one that actually results in effectively protecting people. We've already responded to
Okay, right, okay, so if you want to make this about consequentialism and about like including people, I'd like to point out that, okay, if anger does alienate a certain number of people, these are people who are usually not disposed to your cause in the first place. Often what anger is good at doing is activating the moral sentiments of people who are not aware they stood for that cause in that very first place. It builds solidarity, right? I mean, a moderately argued feminist argument might not be very persuasive to a woman who is not familiar with it. But when it's elucidated in explicit, angry and emotional terms, some person might go, that's something I've actually felt. That emotion is something I share. So if you want to make it about consequentialism, fine. I'll point that at best it's mixed, right? Because you alienate some people, but also strengthen your movement by including more people in it in the very first place. So we do not think democracy is about judging the consequences, but we do think that we give people more information based on which to make their decisions. We also think it's not the case that people are blindly swept up by emotions when they see these things and do not respond. The thing about these sorts of claims, right, about very emotional claims, is that they demand responses, right? If you disagree with it, you are uncomfortable with the fact that that's just out there, unrebutted. So the kind of discourse, in fact, that tends to lead to more consideration of issues is a discourse that begins from extreme statements, but rapidly converges towards the center as arguments from both sides go back and forth. So someone goes, Obama is a dictator, and someone goes, well, that's not true, because lots of other presidents have done similar things as well. In fact, right? And that means that the discussion continues and eventually reaches a fairly moderate point. So if you want to talk about those sorts of things, that's an implausible characterization. But okay, why do we think that these sorts of cultures are uniquely empowering for moderates, assuming the consequentialist metric they want to talk about? The reason is because if we accept Closing's argumentation that this makes people apathetic, right, or makes people care less, then the individuals who are then empowered in a political system to be incredibly persuasive against this backdrop are individuals who are able to take the best arguments from both sides or to present what appears to be a moderate position. Look, moderates often struggle to gain attention without the existence of these sorts of background cultures, because you just sound kind of boring, right? I mean, against a backdrop where like you can watch a sitcom or you can just follow things on Twitter, moderates tend not to be very interesting. But in the wake of Ferguson, the people who got like the most likes on Twitter were the people going, look, clearly the policeman was in a certain position, we need to understand his views as well, and clearly the other side was clearly wrong, but we need to work towards some kind of reasonable compromise. That sort of language becomes especially persuasive when it's set off by radical individuals who are seen as being incredibly emotive and unpersuasive. That's why MLK was successful against the backdrop of Black Panthers, and that's why Gandhi was successful against the backdrop of very violent Hindu nationalism. We are extremely proud.
And I need to remark that in the case for the government bench, I'd like to welcome the government as well.
Everyone in this debate has agreed on one thing, and that's that it's about emotional closure. It's about your ability to perhaps pick what your morals are and express them. Perhaps it's a way for a minority group to explain how they feel. But the reality about emotional closure is that it's something that is long-term. Because when we think about a group who has been oppressed for 2 centuries, the response isn't just anger. The response is being battered and being pained and being oppressed for so long. We don't think the default way of interacting with each other should always be outrage, because the things we feel and the way we need to get other people to connect with us is by using our true emotions. So perhaps that is the grief of a mother who's lost her son and stages a sit-in in the local court. Or perhaps it is someone who's gay and discriminated and shows that in another peaceful way. This debate is about outcomes. It's about people who live in a society who need to come to resolutions on the laws we have. We say the best way for them to do that isn't outrage, is instead the types of silent sit-ins, is the things that are quiet and peaceful protests that reveal how they truly feel. I'm going to look at, I'm going to respond to the closing opposition's argument, then I'm going to look at our extension, then I'm going to look at the open. Okay, so the first point he made was that outrage cuts across interests and allows us to reveal our true preferences. This problem with this was actually raised at OG, right? The problem is, when you have outrage on a particular issue, like the example of Coney, you lose sight of what your true interests really are. It's very hard to pick in a world which your true interests are when there's so many things you could be outraged at. When you live in a community where outrage is the default way of existing, and there's legitimate reasons to be outraged by so many things, it's hard to pick any one of those things as the most important to you. But it was also just false empirically. Think about a time of consensus decision making where people weren't always outraged, right? Think 50 years ago. It's not true to say that the Christians who existed in the past and were conservative, or the trade unionists, or the working class, or the aristocrats couldn't work out their true values or true morals. They can do that perfectly well without the need to resort to outrage. They know what their interests are. They generally know, communities know what their moral beliefs are. All of these things don't require outrage, though outrage may be one element within them. We can't reduce the ability to find our moral answers simply to one type of emotion. But more importantly than that, some people don't react well to outrage. Some people don't find outrage as a way to express themselves or seek moral answers. We think there are lots of people who may be quite conservative or part of religions that don't advocate for this kind of response. They are enormously delegitimized by a culture of outrage because the only way to effectively and legitimately engage with the political system or views is to express anger. Those people are left out of political discussions. So when Ashish wanted to talk about democratic decisions being better, that was entirely wrong. Now we don't make decisions. The US Congress can't appoint judges. The US Senate is frequently filibustering. We're not having a discussion about our true interests coming from our true perspectives about issues and resolving them. We're yelling at each other. He actually needed to show, if he's going to talk about democratic decisions, he needs to show how he gets a pathway there. Let's look at our extension. We think it was very poorly responded to by Ashish. But the reality is that this debate, from the opening half and still to now, is about people who need change. And the people who need change the most are the types of embattled minorities who have faced centuries of oppression. We say that the type of silent type of protest, sit-ins, maybe all sorts, like peaceful protests, those sorts of things, are the best way for those groups to get change. It widens the movement. It brings in the mums and dads and tea ladies and people who are afraid that they don't want to go to a protest where someone throws rocks and burn things. But it also speaks to them more, because it speaks about their true feelings on that particular thing. It buys them in. It's always going to be more effective when a headline says, courthouse has 10,000 in sit-in, rather than, there has been a bombing and 3 revenge attacks against police. That's the reality, and those are the people you need to attract in order to get change. That bench can't get change because they never bring those people on board. They only bring on people who are willing to engage in the culture of outrage. Yeah, close.
A culture of outrage does 2 things for minorities. The first thing it does is that it unites them as a coherent group. The second thing it does is it then empowers the moderates with the capacity to advocate for that group in a way that's particularly powerful.
No, literally our extension is about why it doesn't empower the moderates, right? It empowers the people who initially after an act are reeling from the pain and want to do extreme things, right? Everyone feels that, and sure, the community can get behind it initially. But in the long run, that's not what happens. Because after, it's not just that someone got killed the other day. That's not what the black community is upset about. It is far more than that. It's the fact that every day someone's getting killed and we don't hear about it. It's all of those types of things. She can't just say that outrage, unifies us all. Because in the long run, that's not the feeling we feel. We feel battered and beleaguered, and that is the type of emotion you need to get the moderates on board who get change. And that's our extension I'm going to talk about now. You need the types of people who do sit-ins, who have peaceful protests, who express their true emotions, because they're the ones who convince the others. Because the reality is, and it's sad, is that we won't change who the district attorney in Ferguson is, we won't change the hiring policies in that state, unless we get the white majority. But the way to get those people is to bring on board the moderate black people who are currently sitting at home fearful about protesting. The way to bring them is for them to feel the same emotions that the black people are feeling, to humanize that experience and cut across all sorts of feelings we might feel to things that aren't just outrage, but things like sadness, of loss. Those are things that all humans can feel, and they're equally powerful as outrage, if not more powerful, because people aren't afraid of them. People aren't afraid to vote for change. That is what we offer in extension, yeah.
Given that not all oppressed groups receive the same media attention as Ferguson and are consequently already silenced, how do silent protests help these groups?
Okay, but the reality is, well, let's take another oppressed group. Let's say Group Y. right? If Group Y could manage to get 50,000 people to sit in a diner, I'm pretty sure they'd be noticed, right? And not only would they be noticed, they would be incredibly respected as someone who's non-threatening, who deserves our help. So we don't think that it's true that outrage is the only way to cut across these issues. I've just explained that. Let's touch on the opening. Minorities and victims. I've explained why we provide a better answer for them. I've explained why our long run is more important because we tap into true emotions. But imagine that one-off victim is a victim of a rape, right? For that person, maybe it's true that in the short term, there is outrage. But outrage doesn't get to long-term solutions. So maybe we ban a pickup artist in Australia from coming and saying horrific things. But we haven't changed rape culture. We haven't changed the fact that pickup artists think that those things they do are something that's acceptable. That's why this debate was about long-term outcomes. Only we were able to provide you with that, rather than the short-term angry response, which never gets you anyway. We're the only team in this debate who led you a pathway to actually get change for groups who need it. We're proud.
Thank you very much. And to conclude the debate, the author complaint.
It is notable the story in Ferguson began as a story about houses and the mayor's office on fire. That is why it wasn't just a black person getting shot and the vigil happened, which I wouldn't call the public imagination because it happens in the US to millions, to thousands of people every year. The reason it caught the public imagination was that there was outrage. The reason people gave up their free time, and in many cases their safety, to engage in sit-ins was because there was that outrage. Outrage is necessary for activating people's moral sentiments, but it is also, as Ashish told you, self-correcting. The moderates win out and broaden their critique. Two things in this speech: how the moderates win out and broaden their critique, and why outrage is a necessary part of that, and secondly, why this is not just a justified thing for victims, but an integral part of our moral decision. Beginning at the beginning. Opening opposition wanted to tell us that outrage creates deliberation and discussion. Discourse is the standard debating term, and that is true. What we explained to you was what that discourse looked like and how that discourse transformed into productive outcomes through the empowerment of moderates, meshing all the way with closing government in their chat about Gandhi and MLK. Three mechanisms by which this happens. Mechanism number one: it is difficult to make a pragmatic appeal, right? Because people don't always value pragmatism. It's not the sort of thing that gets a beating in your breast and gets you willing to engage in political advocacy or to look at one out of, frankly, a million news stories in our modern world. When time pragmatism becomes empowering, becomes appealing, is when it is shown in juxtaposition to an altogether different, and yes, they are right, infuriating approach, namely that of radicalism. The moderates in the UK, like the Tories and Labour, have seen membership jump along with membership of the UK Independence Party, because all of a sudden Britain's cushy social democracy is shown in opposition to a radical and often quite racist notion of what it is to be British. But that view would never have had that sex appeal if it hadn't been for that contrast, right? Because it just would be how things are, rather than a response to an altogether more infuriating critique. Secondly, it empowers politicians to use an altogether different type of rhetoric, as Ashish told you. No longer is it just about quibbling over how we divide up our social democratic pie, rather a vigorous defence of the status quo, a rhetorically fueled defence of the status quo in the face of people who would tear it apart. That's rhetoric that, as someone who bases their political appeal on moderation and consensus, you can't engage in when there is no such radical critique. Crucially, in a world of declining political participation, where people are increasingly jaded with politics, where many people are so flooded with information they don't know what to care about, this and the ability to use this to get people out in support of moderation matters. Finally, it broadens your critique. No longer are you standing up for just Republican moderates, you are standing up for moderation and discussion and consensus as a means of achieving political ends. That's something that doesn't just appeal to Republicans, right? That's something to appeal to Democrats as well. Similarly, when you stand up as a peaceful protester in the face of violent protesters, you're not just appealing to people who share your views. You're appealing to everyone who values peaceful protest. That's why some of MLK and Gandhi's most persuasive speeches were not about the cause per se, but the value of peaceful resistance and protest. You can only make that rhetoric which appeals to everyone, not just people who already agree with you, at the point at which you have that to respond to. Let's look at closing government, because they say quite interesting things. They say, we value MLK, we value Gandhi. Importantly, in this is our first response, these individuals only maintain power within their movements with things like the Black Panthers proceeding. Why? Because look, people care a lot about civil rights, right? They care a lot about independence. So when someone stands up and says, guys, I've got a really moderate way of achieving this aim you really passionately care about, oddly enough, people are going to feel like, no, that's hugely in tension with how radically I feel about this. They're going to feel that either way because they're being oppressed, right? Importantly, you can only win power for that moderate pursuit internally, right? At the point at which you stand up and say, actually, you know what? These outrageous people, they fucked up, and I offer a different approach that appeals to a wider range. Secondly, you have what I told you about broadening that critique, right? All of a sudden, these individuals don't just appeal to people within the movement, they appeal to everyone, because now they're so in juxtaposition to a radical approach that everyone dislikes, not just people who agree with the cause. But finally, right, closing government saying, this is very interesting, it makes white people feel like the victim. I think, honestly, right, the civil rights movement is about decreasing the economic monopolisation of black people by white people. Thus, increasing the power of black people will reduce the economic power of whites. I am the victim. I'm also justifiably the victim, ladies and gentlemen. Decreasing the power of patriarchy does make men less powerful. That is the reality of the zero-sum world of domination politics. We'll probably feel like victims anywhere. They'll probably push that narrative anywhere. They'll probably pick out examples of extremism to make those narratives more persuasive anyway. All that a culture of outrage does is activate that discussion in the first place, get people interested, and then allow the moderates to take over that campaign. Let's talk about why this is so important for moral decision making. But first, outrage.
Sir, do us a credit and respond to all the analysis we gave you about MLK being successful because he connected with the battered and pained centuries-old oppression. It wasn't just the existence of Malcolm X. They spoke the same language.
But he would only have had the thousands of people, the millions of people, to make those vigils that were so persuasive and connected in that way, if he'd been able to win power within the movement internally. And he needed the Black Panthers to do that, because intuitively, saying, I'm going to stand up in silence for something you want to go and batter down doors for, right, is never going to be appreciating the work. Let's talk, secondly, about why this is vital for decisions. Because opening decisions said it's justified for victims. It's much more than that. It's vital to how we make moral decisions. Because decision-making isn't some a priori deductive process, right? It's rather about what you feel. And how I value something is not just like something I can deduce from a set of axioms. It's rather something, and the importance of which I determine through how I am made to feel. So expressing outrage, then, is just a natural consequence of people making moral decisions properly and thinking about the actual moral and emotional importance of what happens, right? It's a natural consequence of that, because when you feel it, you will express it. That's how emotion works. So in and of itself, this can only be a good thing. It means people are thinking about moral decisions. But secondly, and more importantly, it's functionally necessary, right? Because often, it's very hard to care about that image of that person getting beaten up by the police as closing government wants to have it. Because frankly, you're shown so many images every day, you don't even look at it. Or if you do look at it, you frankly don't care. It's just another thing. I think that makes that real to you. Someone posting on Facebook whom you know, whom you have an emotional connection with, whose opinion you value, standing up and saying, this is something I care about, and because you trust me, you should care about it too. That's how we get people caring about these sorts of things. At the end of this debate, we're the only people who provide real activation for these campaigns. But more than that, we allow the moderates to win out in the end. Very proud.